Well, we may have a few more people hopping on, but I will go ahead and get started since it's 1 o'clock. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We really appreciate it. And we're so happy to have Dr. Kuldip Dave here with us today, who's going to give us some updates on research, and we'll stick around for a little while afterwards to answer some questions. So Kuldip, if you want to introduce yourself and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Kuldip Dave here. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but hopefully when things are different, I can see you all there. I'm Vice President of Research, and thank you to Jess and the team for inviting me to speak to you about some research progress and update you on where we stand today. So with that, let me see if I can share my screen real quick. And if someone could let me know if they're seeing it. Can you all see my screen? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up from Jed. Okay, so before I get into sort of the specifics of research projects, I think it's really important to understand at the very highest level, where do we fit into this ecosystem? And so, as you may know, we are the largest philanthropic funder in the world. We're not the largest. The government, National Institutes of Health, is the largest funder, and they fund 10 times more than we do. But in terms of the philanthropic world, we are the largest. And I think there are a couple of things that make us different. One is this, on top what you're seeing, this arrows from research to care and care to advocacy and advocacy to research. And we are a three-pronged mission organization. And these are the three main important mission areas. And while today I'm going to talk about research, what you should know is that care services and advocacy are as important in integrating and synergizing the research strategy, so that the research strategy is not happening in isolation, that it is being informed by and informs these two other mission areas. You should know that since the Ice Bucket Challenge in 2014, we have invested over $110 million in research. Who do we fund? We fund academic labs, we fund pharma and biotech companies, we fund contract research organizations, and we fund across the world. And this may be different from some other organizations. There may be other organizations that only fund academia. There are organizations out there that only fund within a particular territory, whether it's a state or a country. We are able to fund all across the world, and we fund the best science wherever it comes from. What do we fund? And again, I'm going to get into this in a few minutes as to what type of areas we fund. But just giving you a very high level, we fund research, and I'm going to talk about the different projects that we fund. We fund infrastructure projects. Now, infrastructure, as you think about, sort of in our daily life, as roadways and subways, infrastructure and research is very important, whether it's development of assays or databases where data can be shared, where we fund training or certification of centers that are running clinical trials. This type of infrastructure is very important because it helps everybody. And so we have a large investment in infrastructure, and I'll hit up some of these a little bit later to give you specific examples. We also fund training and education grants, and this is really important. As a scientist myself, I could tell you that we want new thinking, new people coming into this field. We want to have sort of new brain in the ALS space. And we know that if we are able to fund them early on, that most likely they will stay in ALS. And we need that. We need more and more smart people working in our ecosystem. And so we provide preclinical and clinical fellowship grants to young sort of fellows early in their career so that they can get their first taste of ALS research and then stay on. So really what makes us different is scope and magnitude and this mission integration piece, which is extremely important. This last point here on leveraging 3 times funding, I told you earlier, we are the largest philanthropic funder, but we're not the largest funder. The largest funder is National Institutes of Health. They fund, tenfold or more. And so our goal is not to fund everything. We can't. But what makes us different is we can fund at the right inflection point, and thus being able to leverage or increase the impact of our funding. Last year, a nonprofit organization, RTI, ran a report for us where they showed that $40 million of our funding then resulted in investigators being able to obtain $120 million of follow-on funding from larger funders like the government. And so that is our sweet spot. We can fund early stage, high risk projects so that investigators can get data and then apply for larger funding from larger funders. And so that's really our sweet spot. So before I tell you what we fund, I think it's important to understand this ecosystem. And I'm going to walk you through this very slowly, one by one, so that you understand what we're talking about. And then I'll talk about what we fund. So if you start here all the way on, I don't know if you can see my cursor move, but right here in red where it says biology and genetics of ALS, this is the most important step and the first step for research. This is where you try to understand what is different biologically in people with ALS versus people who do not have ALS. What is different? What is not working properly? What is not functioning properly? What targets or protein targets are changed? Are they less expressed? Are they more expressed? Are they less active? Are they more active? These are the type of things that happen in this area right here. This is what we call target identification, target validation. And this is a centerpiece and really the ground floor of any drug development. This normally happens in the academia. This is happening at universities and colleges, and you find targets here through many different ways that you can develop drugs against. You could do gene sequencing approaches to find different genes that may increase or reduce risk of ALS. And right underneath that is this purple, risks and causes of ALS. Beyond genetic risk, you can look at environmental risk, occupational risk. We know that serving in the military increases your risk of having ALS by twofold, excuse me. And so, it's not just understanding the biology and genetics, but also understanding how is the environment affecting our biology. And so all of this piece, which normally happens in academia, is really important. It's the foundation for what all of this that follows is built on. So once you find a target here, once you find a particular protein that's different or inactive or superactive, hyperactive, then it goes to this next stage called drug development. And this is normally happening in biotech or pharma companies. There's a lot of drug development in academia as well, but mostly it's happening in industry. And here is where you now start developing drugs against the biology that you just discovered right here. And so you develop drugs. This is where you do chemistry and screening and lead optimization and test for whether it works in animals. You test whether it's safe in animals. All of that is happening in this green drugs and biomarkers development. Biomarker is an objective measure for a disease. So, for example, cholesterol is an objective measure that you can measure in blood for heart disease. We don't have such a biomarker for ALS, which would help us with diagnosis, with prognosis, with understanding whether treatment works. And so biomarker development is also very important. And that is normally happening at the, as I said, in industry. If you then find a drug and develop a drug that works in animals and is safe, then it enters into this blue phase, the clinical trial phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And this is where now the drug is tested in humans. So in phase 1, you do a smaller study, you test whether it's safe. Phase 2 is a little bit larger study where now you start to test again whether it's safe, but you start to look at efficacy, whether it works. And then in phase 3, which is very, very large trials, these again where you test for safety, but now you start to look for efficacy in a larger population. And so as you move through these phases, a few things happen. One, each of these phases get more and more expensive. They get more and more time consuming. And there are more and more chances for a drug to fail in any of these phases and fall out. And then there's research on the other side. If the drug does get approved, you now get to this other side where you may want to do research in understanding how that drug is working in the real world. That's called phase 4 research. Technology is moving leaps and bounds every day. And how do we use that technology to make better assistive technology to help people with ALS today? Research into telehealth and telemedicine. This is really important, especially now in the time of COVID. Access and quality of care, family burden, caregiver burden, natural history, how does the disease progress, surveys, patient surveys, where we get to understand the patient perspective and get the patient voice and caregiver voice into research. And then underneath all of this is this piece, the infrastructure piece, where you have research infrastructure, whether it relates to data, specimens, tools, training of researchers and clinicians who carry out this work on top here. All of that falls under here. And so this is a really important slide for you to digest. This is our research ecosystem as it stands right now. And if you are wondering what we fund almost all parts of it. And I think that is really important to understand. We have a fairly large footprint. We fund biology, we fund drug development in preclinical drug development, we fund clinical drug development. And even though, like most organizations, we're not able to fund a phase 3 trial, because each phase 3 trial can be $40, $50, $60 million. We have supported companion studies of phase 3, and I'll point that out a little bit later in an example. Which are important biomarker studies that can happen in phase 3, and they're smaller and still very important. So if you look at our program today, we have over 170 active projects spread across 15 countries. And if you count the commitment we have given to all of those 175 projects, if you count them all up, our total commitment is $58 million. That's our current research commitment. And so again, that's an important number to keep in mind. So I'm just going to take a sip of water right here real quick. Okay, so now you're wondering, how do we go about selecting projects. How do we select like these 175 projects that I just told you? How do they get selected? Our research projects get selected through a very rigorous, transparent, and deliberative process. And I'm going to walk you through that because it's important for you to understand and appreciate this, so that you understand how we vet our research projects. So let's say we launch a funding program. We launch, a funding program. We say, hey, investigators, we're interested in funding biology projects looking at mitochondrial function. Okay, let's say we launch a funding program like that. The first thing we would ask those investigators to do is to submit a letter of intent. And a letter of intent is really a short proposal. It's the elevator pitch that we all know of. Give us 1 to 2 pages, tell us about your high level idea. And all investigators send us that short proposal, and we look at whether this fits the scope of the funding program. Is it a priority for the ALS Association? How novel is the idea? Or if it's not novel, it has been tested before. How is this different from that? These are the type of things we look at this stage. At this stage, if we then say, okay, this is good, we then go back to the investigators and say, research investigators, and say, okay, Dr. So-and-so, please submit a full proposal. And a full proposal is now 8 to 12 pages. And this full proposal now, when it comes back in, is peer reviewed by external subject matter experts. So let's say the funding program is about mitochondria, then we'll make sure we get mitochondrial experts who are not conflicted to review this program. And they use criteria like scientific plan. Is the plan right? Is the hypothesis correct? Are they testing it the right way? Is the team the right team to carry out this work? Is the budget commensurate of the work they're proposing? Is it feasible to do in, let's say, a 2-year period? These are the types of things that this review team is deciding on, and they score each of these full proposals and rank them. This review committee here in yellow will now provide recommendations on what should get funded. Very important, they only provide recommendations. They do not provide approval. The approval is provided by the research committee of the board. And the research committee is volunteers, people who are volunteering their time, and they comprised of people with ALS, caregivers or former caregivers, scientists, basic scientists, clinicians, industry scientists, business professionals. And this research committee is the one that gives the final approval for funding and budget. So while the review committee here provides recommendations, the research committee provides approval. And once the research committee provides approval for that project now becomes a grant. And by the way, now that it's become a grant, we don't forget about it. What we do is we make milestone-based payments. So let's say it's a $200,000 grant. We don't give them $200,000 up front. We give them $50,000 up front, and then at 6 months, they're supposed to show us how many milestones were met. And if they're meeting deliverables, and then we release the 50K. And then they do the same thing at 1 year, and then we release the next 50K. And then we do the same thing at 18 months, and we release the next 50K for a 2-year project. And all of our projects are set up that way. They're set up that way, not because we want to make sure the investigators are doing what they're doing, although we do want to check on that. But we want to make sure that if investigators run into research is unpredictable, and sometimes, it can reach a fork in the road, or sometimes the research stops because of some technical issues, so that we, the association, can work with those researchers and come up with a next step or a plan to keep moving the research forward. And in our grant contract, we have things that are written up like collaboration, sharing data, sharing specimens, so that that investigator is not just learning from that research project themselves, but they're sharing that information, publishing it through publications, so that everybody else learns from that research project. So this is a really important slide to know, because you know, when people ask you how, or you're wondering how you know, projects get funded, it is a very deliberative and transparent process. Everybody knows what we fund. We list it on our website, who gets funded, which universities, how much they got funded for, and what project they're doing. Okay, so one of the things I was told is that you all wanted to know what kind of projects we're funding. So I'm giving you a real taste of it. This is not all of the projects. We've funded like over 50 projects in 2020. So, you know, I've listed 9 examples here. I'm just giving you examples. So it doesn't mean if it's not here, that means we're not funding it. We're probably funding it, but I'm just not showing it to you here. This year was tough. And when I say this year, I mean last year, 2020 was tough. COVID-19 hit us. It not only impacted fundraising across the board for all nonprofit organizations, but it impacted researchers. If the organizations were closed, if universities were closed, researchers can't get in and do the work. They can't get in and do the research that we funded them to do. And so, you know, we had to really adapt to the scenario on the ground. And despite that impact of COVID-19, we continue to fund promising research. And so let me give you some examples here. So starting right up here on the left in blue, remember I was telling you about that ecosystem where you go from basic biology to drug approval. That piece in the middle was the blue piece, the clinical trial piece. And we funded the Healy platform trial for $3 million and committed $3 million for that funding. The Healy platform trial is a very innovative new idea for ALS. It's been something that's been tried for cancer and other diseases, but the idea of a Healy platform trial is that you can test, you build an infrastructure, and then you can test 4, 5, 6, 7 compounds all at once in the clinic. And by doing this, one thing you're avoiding is, you know, running a trial, then taking it all down, running a trial again, taking it all down, running a trial. You're setting up an infrastructure so that you can keep adding or subtracting drugs that can be tested. And by doing it this way, you can save on time, you can save on money. And we're very happy to partner with the Healy Center and to fund and become one of their major funders for the platform trial. Remember, before we get to the clinical trial, there was that green piece, that green section that I talked about, drug development, preclinical drug development. We funded 5 projects to the tune of $2.5 million. We committed to 5 preclinical drug development projects where they're testing, doing chemistry, testing in animals, all of that. Again, this is important because the more drugs we have here, the better it will be that some of that will go into the clinic. I spoke about infrastructure. We funded $650,000 grant to NEALS. NEALS is the consortium that essentially is a clinical trial consortium, and most US trials are run under this NEALS leadership. And so we provided them funding for their infrastructure, for training, so that even if we're not able to fund all individual clinical trials, if we fund the infrastructure, it helps everybody. Remember I told you that we also fund assistive technology projects, and last year we gave $1.5 million to 7 projects to develop new assistive technology for looking at quality of life issues, to looking at caregiver burden. Again, with the idea that, you know, technology has advanced so much, and why don't we use that technology to leverage to make better, you know, better equipment, better ways that people with ALS can interact with the world. Remember, I told you that we don't, you know, like most nonprofits, we can't fund a full phase 3 trial, but we can fund companion studies, and that's what this yellow is. Right here, you may have known or heard that we funded Neuron, this is Brainstorm, who's running the Neuron trial at phase 3. We funded their biomarker companion study. And in fact, I'll give a update on Neuron later, but this biomarker study is now turning out to be a very important piece in the results. I actually was just on a call right here for this project. It just concluded a minute ago, and this is in partnership with another nonprofit organization called Target ALS. We funded a development we funded a biomarker assay development project, gave $350,000 to that project with the idea that we can measure TDP-43 in our blood or plasma or spinal fluid as a way to get a biomarker that's similar to cholesterol for heart disease. We funded fellowships, preclinical and clinical. I talked about this. We need new brain coming into the ALS space. This is a new, right here in green, is a new concept. This idea that we can develop genetic therapies against specific gene-related ALS, gene mutation-related ALS. So we know that there are these ALS patients who have this mutation in the FUS gene. And we partnered with Ionis and Project ALS, another nonprofit organization, to test whether their antisense genetic approach, genetic therapeutic, would work in this FUS patients. And then finally, we launched the ALS Focus platform. And if you are not on ALS Focus, you should sign up for ALS Focus. This is a survey program that we launched where we can hear your voice. We want to hear from you, whether it's about what matters to you, whether it's about insurance information, whether it's about research that you're interested in. This survey program allows us to capture that information and develop research programs and projects based on what we hear from you. So again, this is just a smattering. I'm not, this is not everything, but just want to give you a sense of what we're funding. And just if you're wondering, there is a project in your backyard. Dr. Wu at LSU Health Sciences in New Orleans has a project, $300,000 project where Dr. Wu is looking at the biology to validate a particular target. Remember, I was telling you this is very early on, the foundation of that ecosystem. That's where this project fits in, where it's trying to validate a target for therapeutic development. Okay, so I have talked to you about, Jess, I have time, right? I think I have time. Okay. So I've talked to you about what we fund and, directly. But I think you should understand and you should appreciate that there's a lot we can do even when we're not directly funding something. And that's also really important. And so here's an example of what we do and amplify our role and our dollars. And so, and then what we do, and I gave you a couple of examples on this. We partnered with IMALS on the Neuron companion study. We partnered with Target ALS and the biomarker study. We partnered with Project ALS on the FUS study. We have partnered with MDA on the Stanapel Treg study. Point is that we partner and collaborate with other nonprofit organizations, both inside and outside of ALS space. And if you just look at the external match, if two people come together, now we can expand the project because we can put both of our resources together. And so just last year alone, we had a $1 million external match in co-funding such programs with other nonprofits. While we are providing funding directly, I also sit on advisory committees, and my team members in the research at our office also sit on various advisory committees. I sit on the ALS Investment Fund advisory committee. I sit on the company Orphazyme, who's running the phase 3 arimoclomol study I run on, I sit on that committee. I speak. My colleagues, Jill sits on the Biogen Advisory Committee. I provide presentations at investment conferences. I speak to a small biotech company almost once a week. I've spoken to at least more than 40 companies in the last year, giving them guidance as to how they can invest, how they can do research, how they can collaborate and partner in the ALS space. I sit on the government panel. I told you the government is the largest funder of ALS research, even larger than us. And so I have been invited, and I'm going to be, I've already accepted and I have contributed to the programmatic panel for the Department of Defense. And by the way, this is already outdated. This should save $40 million because of our advocacy efforts and because of your support in helping us push our public policy efforts forward. We were able to double the Department of Defense's ALS program from $20 million to $40 million. I also have conversations with the CDC, the NIH, the VA, the NIEHS, other organizations that fund ALS research. And finally, I sit on the different committees. The HEALY trial, the platform trial, I sit on the foundations committee providing feedback. I sit on the scientific committee for Answer ALS, which is another large initiative looking at genotype-phenotype type relationship in ALS. And again, while not only these two initiatives, we are funding them directly, but I get to have a voice and take your voice and integrate that into these larger initiatives. So you may be interested in knowing what the clinical trial landscape looks like. And so, remember earlier when you were looking at the ecosystem, I was showing you phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And that's what this is. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. If you look, there are over 100 clinical trials that are interventional or observational all across the world. And you can search these sites if you go to www.neils.org. So I'm not listing all of that here. This is just giving you, again, a taste of some notable studies and a couple of things to keep in mind. One, the two asterisks that you're seeing next to some of these, they're actually asterisks means that we either funded that drug, or we funded a technology, or we funded a companion study. So for Neuron's case, we funded the companion biomarker study. For Amylyx's case, we funded the entire phase 2 Centaur trial. And so the point is that, we funded the phase 2 trial, not the entire phase 2 trial. But the point is that, this is a different type of trials that are ongoing. Couple of take-home messages here. What you see here is there are some small molecule compounds, there are some genetic therapies, ASOs, there are things that are targeting the immune system, there are things that are targeting mitochondrial system. You have companies that are smaller like Orphazyme, which is running the arimoclomol trial, and you have companies like Biogen, which are fairly large and are running the tofersen trial. And so our landscape is extremely diversified, and we need this diversified landscape because as drugs go through these different phases, we know that over 95% of drugs fail, unfortunately, and so the more we have in this pipeline. And even before this pipeline starts, as you saw in that big ecosystem slide, the better it's going to be, where we need more shots on goal so that there is a better chance that some of these will actually go through into the pre-approval and hopefully the post-approval stage. So, I'll talk about Amylyx and Neuron coming up in the next couple of slides, but I just wanted to give you sort of, there's a lot of activity here, and it's really, really exciting. So what's the state of the field? I have a couple of more slides and then I'm done. So the state of the field currently is really robust. And let's start from up here in blue. our understanding of ALS has increased leaps and bounds. Remember, I was telling you that's the foundation, the core on which drug development is built on. If we don't understand biology, we're not going to know what drugs to make. And so biology is extremely important. And this is where the ALS Association has funded large gene sequencing approaches, omics type discovery, epidemiological studies. Again, this is all to understand what is mechanistically different, what is biologically different in ALS. And, you know, these large efforts have yielded a lot of good targets. For example, we now know there are over 20 different genes that are related to ALS, and most of those have happened due to our funding, whether it's the funding of Project Mine or Create or Answer ALS or the New York Genome Center. We have funded those large gene sequencing approaches. If you then move here to the red, I think you saw that in the earlier slide. We have many different targets. Again, we need this. We need a diversified portfolio. So we have drugs that are being made against C9orf72, SOD1, GDNF, Tregs, tyrosine kinase. Again, the idea being that the more targets we have, we don't know whether it's going to be one of these targets or a combination of some of these that are going to have an effect. Multiple drug approaches. I again pointed that out in the last slide. We have small molecules in there. We have antibody type approaches. We have AVs, antisense approaches, stem cells. We have institutional engagement right now. The different constituents are engaged, whether it's the government, the FDA that provided guidance to drug makers as to how to develop their clinical trials for ALS, whether it's industry. There's over 100 different companies that are currently invested in ALS. There's nonprofits. We have a ton of different nonprofits in ALS space that are, as I pointed out earlier, working together. Clinical trial efficiency. I told you about the Healy platform trial, where we are becoming more efficient in running clinical trials. NEALS, which is a centerpiece in all of our clinical trials and providing that clinical trial infrastructure. And engagement from the community. You're engaged. You're joining today to learn about what's going on. You are part of, you know, the CDC registry. Please, if you haven't signed up, sign up for the ALS Focus survey program, where we want to hear from you. Point is that the state of the field is fairly robust right now, and it gives a very positive outlook to what we have to look forward to. So I'll switch gears a little bit and get a sip of water again, and give you just a last couple of slides on what's going on in recent news on drug development. And the first one that you probably all have heard about is the results of the Centaur trial. So Centaur, it was a trial run by Amylyx, and Amylyx is testing AMX0035 or AMX35, which is a combination product. It's a product of two compounds that they have brought together in a formulation, and a proprietary formulation. And they tested this product. And you don't have to know all this, but just 2 or 3 take-home messages here. One, it was a robust trial, well-designed, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center, was spread across 25 different sites. And what it showed was that one, it demonstrated an extremely good safety profile, was generally well tolerated. Most adverse events were GI related, you know, gastrointestinal related, but they were transient. They were short-lived. Even more important than that, not that safety is not important, that AMX35 reduced, significantly delayed ALS disease progression as measured by ALSFRS scores. Almost a 25-30% reduction in the progression of the disease. So if you look at it, it was a 2.3 point difference over 6 months. And Amylyx has published this data in the New England Journal of Medicine. And additionally, what was important was that it was not that it was safe and it it had a functional effect, but that in their open label extension study, when they followed the patients and people who had gotten placebo, who now were switched to getting AMX 35, what they demonstrated that there was a 6.5-month increase in survival in participants that were originally randomized to the drug versus those originally randomized to the placebo. So this is really exciting. Based on this data, we, and hopefully you were part of this, had petitioned the government, the FDA, to make and Amylyx to make this drug available to the patient community as soon as possible. Some other updates, and again, I talked about tofersen. This is a genetic therapy that Biogen is developing against SOD1 ALS. They last year reported that their antisense therapy reduces SOD1 levels in CSF of ALS patients. This is really important because if we want to know if tofersen works, the way it works is it's going to reduce SOD1 levels and does have an effect on progression of the disease. And so that's the first step. We need to know whether it reduces SOD1 levels. They have completed enrollment, and we hope that by the end of this year, we get some top-line data that tells us what it does to disease progression itself. I talked about the Healy platform trial. So again, multiple therapies tested at the same time, saving time and money. I think they're currently testing maybe 5 treatments, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe 4 or 5. I forget how many they've added officially. And as of November, they had 30 sites across the U.S. I think they have more now, and over 120 patients enrolled already. NurOwn, the phase 3 study, those data also were reported, the top-line data. These are not published yet, but the company reported these data in a press release. Unfortunately, the clinical trial did not meet its statistical significance in the primary or secondary efficacy endpoints, and that is, of course, disappointing. We want all trials to be successful, and I talked about us, the ALS Association, funding the biomarker companion study, and now it's becoming very important because Brainstorm reported that NurOwn, even though there were no changes in the primary and secondary clinical endpoints, NurOwn did in fact have an effect on the biomarkers. And so now the Brainstorm continues to analyze that biomarker data to try to see if they are able to glean or dissect out any specific effects that may be related to the changes in the biomarkers. And if you would like to participate in and find any clinical trials in your area, please visit neils.org, or you can call Carly at Neils at the number I've given here, or email her directly. And finally, this was the last slide, and I'm not an expert in COVID-19, so there's not much, but I don't know if you knew that the ALS Association just coordinated a webinar from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock today on COVID. And so if you go to our vaccine information page that's listed up here, it will give you links to these other various links that are written here. We have done a couple of podcasts where ALS specialists talk to you more about COVID and COVID-related changes and COVID vaccine. Today's webinar, we've had both ALS experts and infectious disease experts who are going to speak about COVID and ALS. And if you have had a chance to learn about this, the FDA and the CDC leaders came together and provided a webinar a couple of weeks ago talking to the rare disease community about the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the vaccine going forward. And so with that, I'll stop sharing. And I think this is perfect time to start taking Q&A, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. That was absolutely fantastic, super informative. I was jotting down a few questions as you were speaking, and one thing I was wondering, you said something, about the ecosystem, and the first thing that you start with is examining what's biologically different about ALS. So in terms of veterans, we have a large veteran population diagnosed with ALS here in Louisiana, Mississippi. Have there been any deeper dives into, that veteran status, how that, because we know it's across, correct me if I'm wrong, but we know it's across branches, across, times of service. Has there been any closer examination of that, and what may be biologically different about these veterans that are twice as likely to be diagnosed?
Yeah, good question, Jess. So that is an ongoing part of research right now. So a couple of things. One, if you are a veteran and you're interested in being part of this process, in trying to be part of this question that Jess is raising around why people in the military may have a higher risk of ALS, even if you do not have ALS, and you want to provide your samples or register your data. The best place to do this is through the CDC registry. This is where they are. The CDC registry is where they, and I wish I'd put a link in my slides for the registry, where they take all of that information, clinical, epidemiological, occupational, and also collect samples so that researchers can then look at those samples biologically and try to understand what may be different in those samples. And so, and then correlate it back to whether it's, military service or exposure to particular toxins. We don't fully appreciate yet what that biology is. Is it that, weapons grade materials that veterans are exposed to, or personnel are exposed to? Is it, being in different countries? Is it, stress? Is it, head trauma? I mean, there just could be so many different things that could drive that pathology. So, it's important for military personnel to be part of these large initiatives like the CDC registry and sign up and raise their hands so that we can try to understand more about how, what may be different biologically.
Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense. My second question, can you explain to us, for a drug therapy that is ultimately successful, right? So it goes through the whole process, everything goes as planned, and it makes it to that post-approval stage. How long does that typically take from development to, pre-development, development, moving through the phases? Like, if everything went perfectly, what would be the average?
Oh boy. So it depends on where in that ecosystem you start. If you start on the biology piece, it can take 15 to 20 years to go all the way into getting a drug through, developed preclinically, and then clinical testing, and then approval. But what you're asking, Jess, is if it has gone through the phase 2, phase 3, and if it's positive, how long does it take? Well, if it's a positive phase 3, a company still has to put together, an IND package, NDA package, a new drug application package. And the new drug application package could be like tens of thousands of pages. And they have to put this data together, submit it to the FDA. FDA has to now look through all of that data and then provide approval. So that process itself can sometimes take, if a positive phase 3 and now going to the FDA and getting the FDA approval, and once you get in, that process itself can take months to a year. And then once FDA approves it, if they do, how quickly can the company or the sponsor be ready to manufacture the drug and get it to the pharmacy shelves, right? So that process can also be rate limiting or slow. So, our goal from the ALS Association has been, how do we accelerate that timeline, right? Whether it's, you know, if you look at the timeline from biology all the way to drug approval, or you look at timeline from when a drug gets into phase 1 and gets all the way to drug approval, where can the ALS Association come in and, you know, sort of do a pinpoint delivery and crank up the volume at the right time so that we can move things faster. And this is why the Healy trial is so important, because if you do a trial, then you take the whole infrastructure down. You do another trial, you take infrastructure down. But if you have an infrastructure already and then you can test many compounds all at once, now you're saving on time, saving on money, and more people can be involved, and you use less placebo because you're comparing against other drugs. And so the more we can do to accelerate that timeline, that speed, the better it will be.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So this is my last question, and then I'm going to be quiet, I promise. Let's see. So you, the slide where you gave us an overview of the different areas, we obviously have a really diverse research portfolio, I guess you could call it. What areas are generating the most excitement right now? So for you, if you see something new coming out in a particular area, like biomarkers versus technology, kind of where's the momentum right now?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pick, because I feel that we're doing so well in many different areas. A couple of things that I feel are really exciting is some of the early investments we've made, whether it was in the technology that for AnySense technology that we provided funding for almost 10, 15 years ago. Now it's coming to fruition, and you see that a drug is in phase 3, tofersen, Biogen's genetic therapeutic against SOD1. That is really exciting, because when you fund something, you're not sure where it's going to end up, and because it's hard to sometimes see, will that program stop in its tracks? Will it run into issues? Even if it was successful scientifically, who will take it forward commercially? And I think there's a lot of these types of strategic things that you can't really predict. And so when we see projects like tofersen or Amylyx, we fund Amylyx. The central trial was one of the first large trials, phase 2 trials that we funded from the Ice Bucket Fund back in 2016. And we didn't know how that was going to fare. And now it's at a point where they're seeking, and having conversation with regulatory agencies around the world. And so, it's good to see that momentum that that is now building for clinical projects that we funded years ago, and sort of where they have come. The couple of other places where it's getting really interesting is, on the genetic side. So, before you used to, if you needed to do whole genome sequence means looking at your entire DNA of someone. It would take, years ago, it was very, very expensive and take a long time. Now gene sequencing has become so cheap and so easy to do. And that is great, because now every individual, we can get a whole genome sequence data on. So we funded Answer ALS, which is an initiative that's looking at genotype, phenotype. And they have over 1,000 people that they have gotten DNA from, and they're doing a whole genome sequence for all 1,000 of them, and then making all of that data publicly available, so that researchers from all over the world can have access to that data, can manipulate that data, can discover new targets and new proteins and new genes. I mean, it is just the gene revolution that is happening that allows us to find new targets is just blowing up. And that is, I think, where the most momentum is right now, that next generation of new targets for drug development.
It's making me think about 23andMe and those, you know, the at-home kits that you can get now. I did one of those a few years ago, and it's insane the amount of data that you can access about yourself. So I'm sure that becoming cheaper is that kind of play. Just it's easier for people to access that kind of data.
Correct. And we're actually working. We just funded a project to develop guidelines for genetic testing and counseling. Because that it's not really clear when people with ALS go into a clinic or see their doctor. It's not clear. There are no guidelines or rules as to how a doctor asks for a genetic test to be done, or if there's no need for a genetic test, but the patient wants the genetic test, or the family wants to know. There are really no guidelines around this, and so what we're funding is the development of first ever genetic guidelines for ALS that will help neurologists and ALS specialists sort of use those similar guidelines across the board, so that it's not as if you live in New York, you get genetic tests done, but if you live in Kansas, you don't. That it's all across the board, a standardized way. And then how do you get that genetic information put back into a research database so that we are learning more and more about new genes and new targets?
That's really great to hear. We've actually had a couple situations with our clinics where, you know, like you said, families want to know, and the neurologist may not, you know, recommend it for that particular case, or they may, because like you said, there's not a standard for that yet. So it's good to hear that something like that is coming. Does anybody else have questions? I know Mr. Joe is on still. I was going to check the chat box here. Let's see. Well, everybody has everyone's contact information. So if there are any questions afterwards, I will definitely relay those to the appropriate person. And thank you so much again, Kuldip, for doing this for us today. It was absolutely fantastic. Now that you're on our radar, you're probably going to have to do it again.
Hey, I'm happy to. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I like doing this. As you can see, I like talking to the community. It's important for you to know what we fund, how we fund, what what are the processes, how do we measure results, and how do we make sure that we're moving the dial. As you said, just this is a slow process, and the disease is not waiting. It is continuing on. And so how do we accelerate this process? How do we put the pedal on the gas at the right times, or crank up the volume from 6 to 10 at the right inflection points in a project, so that we can accelerate that project and get those disease modifying drugs for our constituents and our stakeholders. And so I think I'm glad that I was able to share with you some of that information, and thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, guys, that's it. Oh, Mr. Joe says it was incredibly informative, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, everybody take care and enjoy your Friday and your weekend.
Bye-bye.